that verse is directed toward children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. It's not parents make your children obey you. In fact, what's directed at parents, the only explicit parenting advice we get in the New Testament, repeated twice for emphasis, is fathers, do not embitter or provoke your children to anger. Those passages and the mutuality that's on display there. I mean, this is the framing of that whole segment, beginning with Ephesians 5:22, I think, the submit yourselves to one another, which I think will make a lot of people uncomfortable if we start saying, what? Parents and children have a mutual kind of relationship? But I do think this is a little bit of the scandal Paul is saying there. Like, in Christ, yes, we are mutually brothers and sisters. So we're parent and child and brother and sister. If parents will allow it, that invites parents to step back and begin to see all the one anothering verses in the New Testament as applying to their familial relationships.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, podcast listeners of all ages and stages, welcome, bienvenue chez épisode 87 of the Jolly Thoughts podcast. You know, if you've been with me for more than 5 minutes, you know this is how I start most podcasts. You know, the ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, all ages and stages kind of bit. Well, rarely, maybe never, has it been as applicable as today. Today, I was privileged to host a conversation with two people, Kelsey, Kramer, McGinnis, and Marissa Franks Burt. They co-wrote this book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting. The subtitle, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families. Now, hey, if you've been with me for more than 5 minutes again, you know that I talk to people on this podcast that I agree with. You know that I talk to people on this podcast that I disagree with. And you know that sometimes I run into a conversation like I had today, which, frankly, challenged me and stretched me. And I still came out on the other end with some of the things in this book that I go, I don't know if this is helpful. I don't know if it's necessarily something that I want to agree with. But there were some things that my mind was changed by, some ways my mind was opened, and ways that I think ultimately will help me to be a more faithful parent and a more faithful witness to Jesus. So listen, as always, enter in advisedly, and then also enter in, hopefully prayerfully. And so, hey, this is going to be, I think you're going to find this to be a good conversation. And I'd love to hear the ways that you bristled against it, as well as the ways that you found it to be helpful for you and maybe you resonated deeply. Let me know. Reach out. Before, or rather without any further ado, no word ado, it's to be offered whatsoever, this conversation with Kelsey, Kramer, McGinnis, and Marissa Franks Burt. Kelsey, you and I have had opportunities to have conversations before. We're not best friends, but hey, I feel like I know you. Marissa, I actually don't really know you at all. And that's actually, I think that's a kind of part of the story in some respects, is the fact that you guys kind of ended up, how did you guys meet? How does a co-authorship like this kind of come to be?
Yeah. So we do have a little story there. So we both were coming at this project from different angles. It had been an idea I'd been thinking about for a couple of years due to work in parish ministry and kind of seeing people grappling with extended family dynamics, people who'd grown up in Christian communities, as well as seeing failure to respond to abuse in my own denomination. And certainly we've seen that across the board in every denomination, and kind of this stuck conversation where parents in the church family system were unable to listen to children who had been entrusted to their care and respond well to that injury, regardless of their parental intent in that sense. And also I had been working on a novel set in the Dominionist subculture of stay-at-home daughter movement. And so all these things kind of came together to make me think a lot about the way distorted theology bears fruit, problematic fruit in people's lives, and enables all manner of harm and abuse. And so parenting teaching kept cropping up in my mind because it impacts relationships down the road. And so one day someone on Twitter asked if you could write a book about anything, what what topic would you choose? And I tweeted out something that basically was the concept for this book in short form. And the response was revealing. I mean, it really resonated with people. And they were saying, I would read that. I wish I had that when I was parenting young children. I think we need that. And it was enough to make me be like, okay, maybe it's time to shuffle this up to the top of the list. And shortly after that, I received a direct message in my Twitter inbox.
That's me. That was me. Yeah. And I told her later after the fact, I was like, I actually immediately wrote a message and then got cold feet and deleted it and then sent it the next day because I felt so conflicted about it. But yeah, so I grew up in what I would call very like normie evangelicalism. My parents were on staff with Campus Crusade for Christ. I grew up a staff kid. Very much like in SBC world, then later in Evangelical Free Church of America in the Midwest. And I did not think about parenting until I mean, truly, I didn't pick up a parenting book until I think my oldest, who's now 8, was about 1. Some people read parenting books when they, are pregnant or when they're expecting. And I just didn't really do that. I was in grad school at the time. And then around the time my oldest was 1, I started thinking, I'd like some footing here as we start moving into like the years where she can talk to me and push back on things that I want her to do or ideas that I have. And I found myself questioning some of the knowledge that was sort of creeping up from my like lizard brain of growing up in evangelicalism. And I thought, I'm not sure that these impulses that I have are great. I'm not sure where they're coming from either because I'd never read a parenting book. So I knew that a lot of it was coming from just ways that I was parented or the norms of my communities. So I went and picked up some of the books that were recommended to me by people in my faith community or by my parents or aunts and uncles. And simultaneously went looking elsewhere for other resources from people I was working with at the University of Iowa who were really into attachment parenting or really into something else, neuroscience. And the gulf between the mainstream resources and the Christian resources sent me spiraling. I did not know how to reconcile these things, right? Like on the one hand, I was reading resources like Shepherding a Child's Heart that strike the fear of God into you about what if you let your kids get away with sin. It's like this ultimate fear versus these other resources that like do not use sin language at all, but focus entirely on this is developmentally appropriate behavior. Here are some healthy responses. Here are some things to avoid. Here's what we know about this kind of temperament, and I did not know how to make sense of those things. So my husband and I are both academics. We kind of just started keeping running documents, lists, books with notes in the margins, kind of for our own study as we tried to make sense of it. And we ended up just kind of leaving the world of Christian parenting resources behind, found some resources that worked for us, and just kind of left that be for a really long time. But until I saw Marissa's message on Twitter, and I thought, I am not the person to write this. As you know, Mark, I write for Christianity Today about worship culture and music and all kinds of interesting things, but that's not my beat, parenting. I'm not in ministry. But I thought, you know what, if this person's going to write this book, maybe some of these notes and ideas would be helpful. So we got in touch and started talking, and as we got to know each other better in our different areas of expertise, we thought, okay, like maybe we could try to see what we could say about this.
And you had lots to say.
And we had lots to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the kind of book that will break your foot if you drop it on you. But we do have here a nicely notated version that you kind of ended up with, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, subtitled How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families. Now, I don't know. I mean, I don't send you guys a lot of questions in advance. And so one of the caveats that I tend to offer is if I ask you something you don't want to answer, I'm very happy with you saying I don't want to talk about that. I'm sure that happens to you in interviews. And so, hey, we can either leave it in or cut it out, whatever is best. Sure. But just to maybe situate, so like right away, if I can already hear some people who are like, oh, these are somehow anti-Christian, non-evangelical people who are telling us about all the problems in the evangelical church. Now, I believe Kelsey, do you attend an evangelical church at this point in time?
Yeah, I do. I mean, okay. It's a Reformed church, but would be very much in like what our collection of evangelical denominations in the U.S. would be. Absolutely.
Sure, whatever that means. And then Marissa, you mentioned you mentioned in our denomination, and then didn't say what the denomination.
Yes,
So, like,
yes.
what is your actual kind of situatedness?
I'm married to an Anglican priest in the Anglican Church in North America. So evangelical, certainly evangelical adjacent, if not some people would see evangelical, conservative, very much a Christian who cares about the church and the health of the church. And that's a big motivator for writing this book. So in the introduction, we sort of humbly ask people to give us an open-eyed read, because we know this can be a tender topic. It can provoke defensiveness or feel like like someone's just poking their nose in to tell everybody what they did wrong with parenting, and that's not our desire. We really did not set out to shame people or heap some additional pressure on parents, so much as to free people up and kind of approach this topic with curiosity and hopefully invite people to find resonance with their own story.
Good. I think that people tend to receive bad news or eye-opening news differently if it's coming from outside their family than it is from coming within their family. Now, it doesn't mean they're always going to receive it better, but they'll definitely receive it differently. And so just for whatever that is, maybe the situatedness might help.
Yeah.
You're both parents? Okay, yeah. And how old? You mentioned that your oldest is 8. Kelsey, how old is your oldest, Marissa?
He is in college. So I don't talk a lot about my family online, but I'm the mom. I'm the mom to 6, and so have a whole range and have read a fair number of resources for myself in my parenting journey. You know, I was not like Kelsey, who's someone who, you know, only read them at a certain chunk. I remember early days reading a number of these. So I've seen them change a bit over a couple decades, just personal experience as well.
That's fair, because the reason I ask about that is I think in the book you mentioned the idea that it's like you should have caution if someone presents themselves as an expert and is not an expert. But one of the things is, like, as an expert, can you be an expert if you have no lived experience in the topic of something? You probably can, but you're more of like it's like an anthropologist at that point in time. You're kind of like studying it from the outside rather than somebody who actually has, some skin in the game in some respects. So enough said, you've raised some kids. All right. So then what is the gist of this book? If you had to kind of put it in a nutshell, and someone's going to they're looking at the back of the spine and trying to figure out whether this is going to be a book they pick up, why would they want this book? Or why would somebody want them to read this book?
Well, I mean, we ended up with the title that we have because it gets at this this kind of core part of a lot of popular Christian parenting teaching, which is the giving out of promises and making certain claims about outcomes and about what God wants parents to do. And within a lot of these popular resources, there are a lot of really wild claims that authors will make about specific things God wants parents to do or commands parents to do, and that certain outcomes will be attached to those, and certain bad outcomes will be attached to failure. And even looking out at society at the time the books are being written and sort of saying that bad thing over there is the result of parents not doing this God's way. We can fix this together. So that's a kind of meandering way of saying there are a lot of false promises made to parents and a lot of threats that come up in these books. And we wanted to help parents examine those, because I think if that's the water you swim in, you don't necessarily see them as promises or threats. You see them as biblical advice.
Yeah.
And Marissa, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would say, exactly that. And we kind of wanted to survey the historical development of these ideas. We kind of start from 1970 on to look at what was going on in society, what was going on in the conversation in the broader evangelical church, like theologically speaking, that contributed to the ways these ideas developed. We also wanted to survey some of the recurring themes across them to say, what do we really find here? What are the things that crop up again and again and again across the resources? And then we also wanted to consider the impact. So we read a number of primary sources, and then we surveyed individual individuals who they were either adult children reflecting back or older parents reflecting back, to kind of hear about their experience, to kind of get a sample group of like, well, this is what it looked like in how families applied this, because of course that could vary a great deal. So we wanted to be able to have the primary sources to sort of imagine, what if people applied this faithfully? Let's talk about that. And then to hear from some people and say, hey, this is what it looked like in my home. So we could kind of examine the fruit.
Yeah, that's good. So like the methodology then, so I read Beth Allison Barr's Becoming the Pastor's Wife early last year. And I can't remember how many primary books they read, but a lot. So when you guys were like, hey, let's read some, starting from 1970 on, how many like books, actually, do you have a sense of how many books there are kind of in the published field? Like, could you even ballpark? Is it 100? Is it 1,000?
It's
like
well over 100.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I don't have a ballpark number. I mean, some of these are self-published. Like
sure.
in terms of resources out there, I don't even want to try to ballpark it. Well over 100. I mean, since 1970, there are a ton.
Yeah.
We read over 100 for this
together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then so that's a lot of the kind of the primary sources. But then you also mentioned the interviews and how did you guys get interviews? Were they just kind of anecdotal, or did you have like a systematic way of getting some kind of field research, I guess, in terms of like the people themselves?
Yeah, we did put together a survey, which we sent out. We are really careful to say this is not an IRB reviewed study. Neither of us are social scientists. We do not want to claim that this is a representative sample of American Christians. These are people who are self-selecting into sharing their stories. So people who responded to this survey are people who had knowledge of these resources and had experiences to share. Like, here's how this panned out in my family. And so we're pretty careful to use them that way in the book. We don't make claims about, for this number, this percentage of American Christian families who read these books, these outcomes. And frankly, there's really, I would love for someone to try to figure out a systematic way to get that kind of data. Parenting is notoriously difficult to study, even for like pediatricians relying on parent-reported data about things like feeding and sleeping, right? Like people who study infant sleep will say like it's really hard to get parents to accurately report like how much their infant is sleeping, how often they're getting up during the night. So anyway, all that to say, we want to be careful about how we frame that survey. We did have, I think, close to 90 people share their stories with us, and from a range of experiences. And those stories are really used to kind of explain, like, here is a teaching in these books. Here is someone who experienced this, and here is how they reflect back on it now, which we think is useful and is something that I do quite a lot as a journalist. It's something that journalism doesn't claim to be comprehensive, but it does claim to be illustrative and helpful. And so that's how we try to frame this.
Yeah, and when we selected this, because out of all of those responses, there's only small portions in the book, but we did attempt to select ones that would illustrate, that were representative of a number of responses we got. Not to try and claim this is what it was like for everyone, but to say we heard this enough, and this kind of captures something here to show what that might have been like for a child or what that was like for a parent, that sort of thing.
Right. Okay. So excellent. Now, what are some of those things? Or maybe like one or two, because we want people to pick up the book themselves, of course. But as you're kind of working through it, what are some of the? Maybe this would be a good inroad. What are some of the promises, maybe, that seem to be made in general through these kinds of through these books?
Well, I think a big one that probably comes to a lot of people's minds when they think of Christian parenting is train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. So this very appealing promise that if you get parenting right, you can expect certain outcomes, even eternal outcomes for Christians. This idea that faith formation is something that can be secured and guaranteed early on, such that you can have the reassurance that your child will be a Christian well into adulthood. So that is very appealing and comes in a number of forms. Along with that, often parents were told that their children could be arrows in the hands of a warrior. So drawing on these biblical motifs, right? But, and that was framed in culture war terms. So if you get this right, you can kind of transform society, you can transform your communities. Sometimes the promise was made that your family could be a testimony that would win people to Christ. So it was presented in missional terms or even generational terms. Like this could impact your family for generations. You could build a generational legacy. So those are some of the really appealing promises that really tie into both the longings of parents to know that their child will be okay and good and will flourish, but also into a longings of devout people that faith would be transformative in their lives. And this was paired alongside with fear-mongering, really, to say if you don't get it right, very bad things could happen, and kind of your parental worst nightmare can come true, often described in very vivid anecdotes and descriptions on the pages of these books.
Okay, so we're told, that verse being probably like the decoder ring for I mean, you say this in the book in some respects, like it is kind of like the one verse to rule them all. So train up a child in the way that they should go, and when they're old, they will not depart from it. So then that puts a lot of then you have to train. So then what does the training then? I mean, I guess we're assuming that the way they should go, because this is a Christian book, is they should Jesus Christ is the way. So we're hopefully angling them towards Jesus. Hopefully,
you would hope, wouldn't you?
Right? Maybe. Well, just leave me my delusions for a moment. So we're angling them towards Jesus. But then, what is the way then that we are being told to train them? What are those kinds of like actual? Because I'm assuming they get some of them are probably principle based, but then some of them are probably quite practice based, where you actually have like, here's not how you should think, but here's how you should act, right? So what are some of those things that you see kind of recurrent themes throughout these books?
Yeah. I mean, you would think that pointing children towards Jesus would be would come up often, but you'd be surprised how often that's not the orientation of these resources. And so I think, we started in 1970 because that's the year James Dobson published Dare to Discipline. And I think Dare to Discipline is a really instructive example of some surprising elements of these Christian parenting resources that people venerate so much, because this book is, I would say, a conservative book, not a Christian book. Like it is not particularly religious for the most of it. It's very behaviorist. So James Dobson was, working at Los Angeles Children's at the time. He was a psychologist and had education experience. He's very much writing from a behavior modification perspective. Like for him, this is about kids these days having no discipline, having no respect for authority. We need to assert parental authority to like right the ship of our households and of American culture. So this is very much like the way they should go is obeying their parents. Like that is the way. Like it actually has very little to do with Jesus, except that presumably the parents are following Jesus, right? But in terms of like practically articulating what it means for a child to go in the way they should go, you will see it said over and over again in these books that the highest calling of children is to obedience, period. Nothing else really matters. And it's not always clear when that stops being the case, right? Like at some point, I think everyone reading these books would agree, like at some point, my children's highest calling is certainly not obedience to me. But that is really, that's consistent across many of these resources. Even people you might not necessarily expect, like Chuck Swindoll, his book, The Strong Family, is all about parental authority as the first principle of the job of a parent. And it is very much about parents asserting authority and children being obedient. And that kind of framing is like both practical and not, because then it just becomes about parental preference, desire, and in some cases whims. Because parents aren't always given the tools in these books to differentiate between disobedience and like disagreement with an idea a parent might have. It sets up everybody for a pretty adversarial relationship. And that, I think, comes with all kinds of problems
Yeah.
downstream.
Yeah, it really does. And it's not just what's included in these resources, but what's absent. So most of them have no consideration, frankly, of child development. So at that point, you also have expectations are often very clearly given that parents should expect instant, unquestioning, cheerful obedience, first-time obedience, it's sometimes called, that they can and should expect that. So then when you combine that with what Kelsey mentioned, that kind of everything a parent is told they are agents of God in these resources. So everything a parent desires, that could becomes the issue of what the child needs to obey. Sometimes it's framed in sin terms. So if a child doesn't do what the parent wants or doesn't respond instantly or cheerfully, that's just kind of categorically presented as sin, which isn't really defined in a number of these resources. It's just defying your parents is sin. So that, I mean, it sounds a little bit bananas when you reduce it to that, right? But this is when you start to peel back the curtain in these resources, this is really what's at the bottom. Now, sometimes it comes with proof texts, or sometimes it comes with examples, or it pulls on the levers we mentioned. But that is the primary thing parents are being offered, which, as you can imagine, when you play this out, when there isn't an off-ramp for this, some of the resources will give a nod like, well, when adult children marry, then it's leave your parents and cleave to your spouse, right? That will be kind of the only off-ramp kind of given in a number of them. But this is why this tracks with what a lot of adult children then say, where it becomes very difficult for them to engage as adults with their extended family members because parents still expect compliance to ideas, politics, denominational affiliations, any number of things, because this idea that children are either extensions of parental will or will comply with parental will persists. And families are left bereft of the tools to practice listening to one another in mutually respectful relationships, because that simply has been absent for the relationship day in and day out for a number of years. So some families now, of course, the disclaimer needs to be said, this varied according to individual families. So some families mitigated this in different ways or exacerbated this in different ways. But when you look at the resources themselves, this is what is directly being offered to parents. You act in a godlike role. You can expect that kind of obedience. In fact, if you don't require that, you are being disobedient. So parents also are expected to obey this kind of idea that everyone falls in line with the expectations presented by these experts.
Right. I think you refer to, or you point to some resources like umbrella of authority kind of scenarios. But before we go there, I wonder, and this is completely off the top of my head, but I've said it aloud before to other people. I wonder, even if you said, Marissa, like, I think you used the term like adult children or whatever. And like, we don't have a good way to refer to our offspring when they're not, because children means young people, right? Like, it doesn't mean like you can't be an adult young person. Like, I mean, we have created this subculture where you can, but like my son, he will always be my son, but he will not always be my child, right? Like, there has to be this point where they become not related by their age or their, anyway, I think that does permeate the way that a lot of us tend to think about our
and I think those rhetorical details are interesting. Like, even when you ask someone, they say, I have 6 children or something, which is an interesting phrasing, right? Like, it kind of implies ownership. And it's in our parlance, so I know it also means belonging, but there are these interesting revealing things, yes, absolutely, about our vocabulary choices that show how difficult it is to kind of parse this out. Good point.
Okay, but then, so and again, I'm my own interlocutor here in some respects. So like, I hear myself saying to myself, okay, so authority, it kind of sounds like you just described the idea that if authority is almost bad. Like, you could have heard somebody could have heard you say, trying to exercise authority over your children is bad. You didn't, but you could have heard that. And so I'm like, I think it's Ephesians 5. I don't know. It's some kind of household codes. It's definitely Paul. The idea, like, children, obey your parents as is fitting in the Lord. Like, so, like, checkmate. What are we supposed to do with? Because if we don't want to throw out the Bible, and if we actually value the Bible, what does it seem like this this could be telling us about how we're supposed to relate to our children?
Mm.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll let Marissa tackle the kind of application of scripture piece here, but I will say, like, this authority bad kind of reading of what we're saying, I understand why it would seem that way, and I would say, like, I'm always amazed when people say, that you're saying authority is bad, because parents simply do have authority over their children. Like, in the U.S., I mean, legally, parents have authority over their children. Children know that. They know they can't hop in the car and drive themselves to school. They know they can't go to the grocery store and get, like, children know. It is true. Like, it simply is true. What these resources do is convince parents that their authority is constantly under attack. There are constantly these forces that are attacking your authority. When Dobson's writing in 1970, no-fault divorce has just become more widespread in the U.S. It's become legal in California. There is this belief there's attack on the nuclear family. This is an attack on parental authority. So a lot of these resources really go out of their way to make parents feel like their authority is being attacked from outside and from within by their children. That, like, the outside world is going to attack your parental authority. Your children are constantly going to attack your parental authority. And so it makes parents who, like, already could rest in this peace and high calling and responsibility of, I have been entrusted with the care of these children. I want to do this the best I can with God's help. It takes that and escalates it to this, like, wartime mentality. You know what I mean? And that, I think, is bad. I think that way of viewing the position parents are in, I think, is unhelpful and has been mobilized against parents in some really harmful ways.
Yeah. And I think also it can present people with a false binary. Like, it's either this kind of authoritarian umbrella of authority, hierarchical code, or nothing, permissiveness, and I think that's just a fallacy. There's a number of things in between, including considering what Jesus's model of leadership is, because he's very clear that his followers should not be interested in lording it over each other, which really should kind of question some of our ideas about, I think, those kind of hierarchies, especially since when we look at Ephesians 6, which is the household codes that talks about parents and children. Yes, but that verse is directed toward children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. It's not parents, make your children obey you. In fact, what's directed at parents, the only explicit parenting advice we get in the New Testament, repeated twice for emphasis, is fathers, do not embitter or provoke your children to anger. In Ephesians 6, it's followed up with, but bring them up in the instruction and discipline of the Lord. But that is, if we want to look for an imperative directly to parents, it's that, not to embitter or provoke them. And I think an argument can be made. I was talking with a New Testament scholar, Bruce Fleming, a couple weeks ago on a podcast, and he was talking about those passages and the mutuality that's on display there. I mean, this is the framing of that whole segment, beginning with whatever, Ephesians 5:22, I think, this submit yourselves to one another, which I think will make a lot of people uncomfortable if we start saying, what? Parents and children have a mutual kind of relationship? But I do think this is a little bit of the scandal Paul is saying there. Like, in Christ, yes, we are mutually brothers and sisters. So we're parent and child and brother and sister. And that invites, if parents will allow it, that invites parents to step back and begin to see all the one anothering verses in the New Testament as applying to their familial relationships, to be forbearing, to be compassionate, to restore the one who sins gently, to love our neighbor, including our smallest and newest ones, to consider others as more important than ourselves, and to begin to perhaps meditate on the example of Jesus' leadership, which is to serve. And I think, sometimes you can find a few of those sprinkled throughout the most popular resources. There are certainly a few who lean into that. There are a handful. We note them when we talk about corporal punishment in particular, because these things track together. There are a few resources that do speak of children in those kind of mutually respectful ways. But those consideration of those biblical principles are remarkably absent, just as is discussion of the way of Jesus himself. Sometimes you'll hear the resources refer to Christ, or like leading children to the cross, or these kind of like generic ideas about really helping children to become Christians, whatever is perceived as that. But not so much the idea of considering the Gospels and the example of Jesus.
Wow. That's really, that's very interesting. This kind of the multiplicity of relationships that we have, right? Like that we can be both. I mean, like Jesus himself claims, or the writer of Hebrews anyway, claims that Jesus is our brother.
Yeah.
And yet he's also our king.
Mm-hmm.
I remember watching The Crown, that Netflix series, and just watching the way that like the prince would interact with the queen. I'd be like, sometimes you approach as though she's the queen, and sometimes you approach as though she's your mom, and it's kind of like, ooh, interesting. I think that's a good model for how we can think about it. Okay, all right. Well, you mentioned corporal punishment. Let's go. Okay, so I mean, like, we may as well at least talk about it, because to me, this was one of the most confronting portions of the book. And what's interesting is, I mean, I know that Kelsey, you're familiar with the book, A History of Contemporary Praise and Worship. I read that a few years ago, and as I was reading through the book, it was in some respects similar in the sense that they have done a deep dive and a bunch of different resources about worship music, primary resources all the way back to like the 1940s and beyond. And I realized that though I had read like almost none of those books and really imbibed none of those original resources, I was totally swimming in the waters that they themselves, because it was describing my church experience, and therefore the way that I was formed. So similarly, I have read none, like absolutely none, of the parenting books that you're describing. And I don't know whether or not my parents did either. But I'm totally familiar with the world that is painted by the kinds of descriptions that you have in this book. And so I'm just fascinated about this one when it comes to discipline. This morning, as I was walking, I was listening through through the Bible in a year plan. I'm in Isaiah, and I can't remember, I wrote it down, but it's not worth looking up necessarily right now. But it was this idea of like God disciplining his people, right? And disciplining in this instance was like when they went into exile, right? It's pretty rough. That was the spanking of all spankings. How are we how do these books tend to talk about the idea of discipline? And then I'm assuming, spoiler, I've read the book. I know that you have challenges with how these books talk about discipline. So on the other side of that, are we, again, just to be a discipline-free world? Like, how are we supposed to help our children when it comes to, is it all just time ins instead of time outs? Like, what is actually like supposed to be done to help our children be disciplined in the world? And that's a really wide-ranging question, but it's the one that I think stands out the most. One of the things that stands out the most to me after reading the book, I guess.
Yeah, I want to say a few things, and then I want to turn it over to Kelsey, because she always has good things to say about the way forward here. I want to note, I think I'm glad you brought up the Isaiah concept, because this comes up with a lot of people. It's a good question. It comes up in a lot of conversations around Christian parenting and discipline. And I think a couple of things to set the stage for the discussion here are important. One is that even in that anecdote, it is interesting that the immediate reading would place parents alongside God and children as those under the parental discipline, right? Because that, again, refers back to these ideas in the water that parents are agents of God. They act in godlike roles. So whatever a parent perceives God as doing is what they should do. Rather than a paradigm that says parents are part of the gathered community of God, who in this instance are people who for generations have been receiving his provision, nourishment, invitation to repentance again and again and again. And it's at the end of this that they are given over to the fruit of these choices, of the rebellious choices they've made. And I say that not because discipline isn't on the pages of Scripture, but this idea that God is instant, swift, disciplinary, and therefore we have that kind of authority, and we should be that way, is filling in a lot of blanks. Because when God names himself, it is that I am compassionate, long-suffering. Yes, he corrects, he instructs, he trains, he guides. These are all concepts of the elements of the biblical concept of discipline. And that's a second point. Discipline does not equal spanking. So many evangelicals, that is an equation in their mind. When they hear discipline, they think spanking. And we argue that that is really a product of James Dobson and his errors. That is how we have come to understand that. Discipline, biblically speaking, includes instruction. It's discipleship. You hear it there even in our English word. And so that maybe can hopefully invite parents to say, okay, so maybe I've gotten this equation, because absolutely this comes in the resources, but also from pulpits, from sermons, from parenting conferences, from older parents talking to younger parents. This idea that Christian parents are required to corporally punish their children, that God wants them to, that it's not just maybe behavioristic as it would have been done in years past, that, yeah, parents in for centuries view their children more like property who can be hit into compliance. But with evangelical resources, you see an attempt to distinguish there and say, oh no, what's happening here is actually something very godly and it's godlike. And that can give us confidence that, yes, we must do this and this will have good fruit. And unfortunately, that keeps a lot of parents stuck without critically examining what they're actually doing. They're stuck. They're not reflecting to maybe their own intuition that says, I don't want to do this, or I feel upset when I do this. I don't feel good in my body when I'm spanking my child, or to look at the research, the decades of research we now have that says this is tied to poor outcomes. It's not effective, and it actually causes harm. Or to listen to adult children who say, this is what it was like for me. Spanking was very harmful in my life or destructive. And so instead, parents will think, oh, but this is biblical somehow. And this is something I need to do to obey. And some of the resources even say things like, you need to spank in faith and trust God that his ways are higher. And these sort of like Christianese ideas that really short circuit critical thinking. And it's so unfortunate. Like when we set out to write this book, we knew we would need to address spanking. I don't think we fully grasped how deeply rooted this is in American evangelicalism. And this is still a hill a lot of parents want to die on, particularly in certain areas of the country. We heard from people who are excommunicated for refusing to spank their children. The entire community is bought in on this. Many people hear sermons on this regularly. So we don't give parenting advice in our book. That's not our goal. This is one thing we actually speak quite directly on and really beseech Christian parents to reconsider this, to recognize this is not required of them. That's the argument we make. But as far as alternatives, how would you answer that, Kelsey, or what would you add?
Yeah, I mean, we don't we don't really offer alternatives, not because we want to be critical without being helpful, but because spanking is one behaviorist tool that has been baptized by decades of kind of weird biblical scaffolding, and we talk about that scaffolding in the book. And without that, though, parents have so many relational tools, but I think it is both like uncomfortable and freeing to say, I have a mutual relationship with my child. Children are different from adults in some ways in terms of certain thought capacity and certain understanding, but they are fully human. They are capable of encountering God. My husband was just this morning, he's reading Confessions by Augustine, and he this morning was reading the passage where Augustine reflects on being beaten in school. And Augustine's reflecting on his earliest prayers as a child in school, pleading with God, please let my teachers stop beating me. And to me, that's like this incredibly powerful thing. You have a child reaching out to God, acknowledging like this pain is being given to me punitively. Please take it away. Like there's so much there that I think is worth looking at, saying like children are not machines and they're not pets, but behaviorist kind of spanking methods they're simply behavior modification. And over time, what's been done is this kind of gymnastics to say, well, the only way you can teach children is through this. They'll never learn to respect authority if you don't cause them pain. At the same time, it's not punitive though. This is discipline. We're not punishing sin, right? Like there's all kinds of gymnastics that parents do. When you remove that piece, though, when you remove the God commands us to spank our children, then suddenly you have to step into relationship with a child. and meet them where they are and look at the child in front of you and learn about their individual quirks and needs and communication style and challenges. It is hard. But I don't think it's actually taking away a good teaching tool. It's actually taking away a very convenient place for parental frustration to land. Like I would argue, and this is just sort of me theorizing, but I think that feels scary for parents because they feel like they've been told, I need to be irate about my children's sin. Like my children's rebellion is sin. I need to come down hard on it without the ability and the permission to hit your child. It feels like that has no place to land for parents who've been told they should spank their kids. That feels scary. But in every other human relationship we have, that's also the case. Like marriage can be hard for this exact reason, right? Negotiation with someone is hard. Like relational negotiation is hard. And so I think one thing these resources can rob parents of is the sense that they are supposed to have a mutual relationship with children and that connection is possible. And that when it feels like there's this impasse and you don't know what to do, like it will be okay. Like I think Christian parents are just told that's not okay.
Yeah,
It's not
you have to
okay.
win.
You need
Yeah.
to win. You need to win every time, right? This is the Doug Wilson thing. We need to win every time. And so I think leaving that behind is the way forward. And then it's freedom for parents and their children to form relationships that reflect the sort of beautiful individuality of each family and each person in that family.
It is highly possible that it is just the water that I swim in that is speaking. So like I appreciate it. Like that's beautiful. I appreciate all that. There is this, man, when you said like you got to win, there was something in me that was just like, you probably do though, right? Like you probably like, and what I mean is like there has to be I am an egalitarian, and so my wife and I we the kind of situation that you described, Kelsey, like that's a negotiation. That's never. But I'll just say I'm not convinced that I'm an egalitarian. Oh, how to say, when it comes to the relationship with my children,
it's uncomfortable, right?
Like I value them as equals, but I don't think that my relationship to them is the same as my relationship to my wife. Yeah. And so there is a bit of I'm left with a slight tension here where I'm not supposed to be training my wife. And I mean, we're all supposed to be kind of like, leading one another through mutual submission and through that kind of a group dynamic. But I don't know. There's something hanging with me. So the idea that like another book that I've been painfully working my way through the summer is Dan McClellan's The Bible Says So. And one of the chapters that he has is the Bible says you're supposed to beat your kids. And he would argue, and I don't agree with him most of the time, to be honest with you. It's like kind of a hate read for me in some respects. I'm just like, I got to engage with this content because I know a lot of people are really interested in imbibing it. But he would argue that a metaphorical understanding of the Proverbs that say you should use the rod or else, and I know that's an aphorism saying, spare the rod, spoil the child, but rod shows up a lot. And if you try to kind of extrapolate that out to just like take their phone away, that's actually like you're doing the same kind of thing you said earlier, Kelsey. You're doing gymnastics to kind of make that mean what it's supposed to mean. Now, I'm not sympathetic to that. I do believe that we can look at the principles behind it rather than the actual practices behind it. But I'm there for the principles in some respects. So I'm just like, I feel like there is some kind of discipline. And I totally appreciate the fact that your book is not about telling people, like giving them actual practical advice on how to do that. It's one of my favorite things to do is to give people questions and then go, okay, bye. But I do appreciate the fact that's not the purpose of the book. But I just want to say for myself, that is one area where I'm like, I don't know that I'm to the place where I don't want to quote unquote discipline my children.
Right.
I just don't know. But I also, for the record, don't want to hit my kids. Just so I'll put it that way. Well, and I'm not there for that.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. And I would again note that the idea that discipline equals primarily something punitive is maybe baked into our like interpretation in ways that are worth examining, because I do think the idea of discipline as discipleship might be able to let us read the Proverbs, as I would argue. I disagree with Dan a little bit when he talks about spanking on this as well, because I think the intent of the Proverbs is to cultivate wisdom. This is what they're given to us. We know they're not commands, we know they're not mandates, but they are drawing from daily life in the ancient Near East to help the reader cultivate and the listener to cultivate wisdom. So in that sense, we are always applying them metaphorically, right? We're not putting knives to our throat if we overeat. We don't read that and think that's a good idea. That's what they thought should even happen, right? I don't think so. So I think we can say that yes, in the ancient Near East, young adult sons were often beat on the back with clubs. They were caned. There was public shaming going on to respond to rebelliousness. Perhaps that would invite us to say, okay, if this was written to the royal young men of a household, maybe that would let us let go of the idea that these are verses that we really need to apply to toddlers and small children. Like, I think that's an important consideration to make. But your broader point, this idea of discomfort with letting go of discipline, again, I think is maybe hanging on an either or dichotomy that's not necessary. And I think would be helpful again to return our attention to the ways Jesus led or corrected or discipled those who followed him, because he does correct, he does instruct, he does teach. And I think that can include consequences. Certainly, we see that in the narrative portion. Sometimes natural consequences for people's rebellion or mistakes or wrong choices. And sometimes, yes, God engineers consequences and meets those out. But I think that should be very carefully and humbly done, right? As those who have been entrusted with the care of another human being, which is a very different posture than what is presented in these resources, which is kind of like, you are in a godlike role, unquestioned authority, meet that out to get what you need, to get that instant compliance. Because in the end, I think that heart posture is also relevant, because whatever parents are telling themselves, if their primary desire in employing spanking is to be unbothered by their children, to be untroubled by the messiness of having to relate to another human being, that is not at all what we see with the concept of God's discipline, however you come at it. And it certainly short circuits it's very short term. It may achieve compliance in the short term, but all the things we talked about at the beginning, it really hijacks relationship, because parents have learned to see their children primarily as existing to comply. And that really hinders families down the road from being able to relate in authentic ways, because there's it's difficult to try and get up to speed on that when you're talking to maybe a 30-year-old or 40-year-old child at that point, if you've never trained yourself to see a child with mutuality, or trained yourself to see those opportunities for Christian maturity in yourself in the discomfort of those relationships. So anyway, Kelsey, I see you nodding too. Do you have thoughts with that?
Yeah, this is where, like, I think it would also be really helpful for some Christian parents who are uncomfortable with going to mainstream resources. So many of these Christian parenting resources really demonize, like, the mainstream parenting advice, like this permissive. But actually, if you go out there, and we actually call out Cloud and Townsend's Boundaries, which is a Christian book, Boundaries with Children, there is language of dealing with hard behavior that you can absolutely find help with, and like language that involves consequences, right? But one thing that I find helpful about some mainstream parenting advice is that it does free parents up from feeling like they need to be making all these relational decisions with an eye toward dealing with their children's sin. Not because I don't think sin exists, but because I think your posture towards your children is very different when you are thinking about cultivating relationship versus dealing directly with sin, right? It's putting the emphasis on something else. So when Becky Kennedy, author of Good Inside, she gets a ton of grief from evangelicals because of that title, Good Inside, right? Your kids aren't good inside, they're sinful.
Only evil, always. Only evil.
But there is probably some useful advice there for parents who feel like, well, then what can I do if I can't spank my children? What can I do?
Mhm.
It is really helpful to read advice from people who for decades have just been assuming that's not on the table.
Mhm.
Now it's about cultivating a healthy relationship, a relationship where there are boundaries that are enforced in our household for everyone's health and well-being.
Mhm.
And where the parents are absolutely authoritatively in charge, but aren't necessarily feeling like their authority is being attacked. They're just sort of dealing with the difficulty of parenting
Mhm.
in different terms. And again, I don't hear me and say like we just need to forget about sin or just assume your children aren't sinning, or how you view your children's sin nature is very contingent on what your worldview is. And there is variety about
Mhm.
that in the church. So, I mean, and regardless of what you think about original sin, about age of accountability, all those things, I think that can be
Yeah.
helpful to read about child development and parent-child relationships that takes a step back, turns down the temperature on the pressure on parents to deal with sin, and like frees up
Yeah.
an eye toward relationship.
And one tiny last thing on that too, to say once we remove this idea that there's something liturgized or God endorsed about spanking toddlers and preschoolers, it can really enable us to look at the data that just says this isn't an effective disciplinary tool. So even for parents who do want to discipline, who feel that strongly, like it's just not effective for that. So there are better ways to do that that are ethical, that are in alignment with what we do in other relationships, like teacher and student and employer and employee, that have some sort of like expectation for compliance. So that might help some parents too, because I think that gets very very little consideration by evangelicals because they hold this belief. But yeah, there's a body of evidence that says, yeah, this isn't effective. It's actually associated with long-term behavioral problems. So it's not effective. It's a little bit magical thinking, the way we approach this in evangelical circles.
Well, and I appreciate what you said earlier about the idea of like wisdom literature being about teaching you wisdom, not
Mm.
about giving you kind of like mathematical inputs and outputs or whatever. And so I think that's something that we're not always taught to think about when it comes to the Proverbs. And so it's like, hey, man, it's the scriptures. Tell me what to do. It's like, okay, yes. But also, hold them together and kind of see what the whole, as you kind of not only take it in bites, but take it as a whole and live through it. What is it telling you about how you think about and feel about God, like altogether?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, one other thing that I found really, really helpful about your book was the way that you framed our understanding of children as being quite vulnerable. And
Mm.
so even though the Bible doesn't usually, I don't think, I mean, we certainly have the Jesus saying, suffer the little children to come unto me.
Mm.
The kingdom of heaven, you'll receive it if you become like one of these. But like when you think of the Old Testament, when you name like the widows and the orphans, I mean, orphans, yes, but the stranger or whatever, these kind of like often use the word marginalized, but I prefer the word vulnerable, these
Mm-hmm.
vulnerable people groups. That in some respects, children are very vulnerable. Like
Yeah.
they are reliant upon you. And so then helping that kind of twist your perspective just enough to be like, oh, okay, I have to really care for. I mean, of course you care for your kids. Of course you do.
Yeah.
But helping that be framed in such a way that it's like, but it's for their general good and they're just not just their outcomes in terms of like obeying me, but their outcomes in being healthy, loving people in the future. This is what we're
Mm-hmm.
kind of shooting for much longer term. It's been almost an hour. There's one thing I wanted to say, and I don't even know if I have
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know if I want to crack it open, but like, I'm curious. So, Dobson obviously features very highly in your book. He just passed away not that long ago. I'm sure it's funny. We haven't heard, or at least I haven't. I bet you guys your algorithms look a lot different than mine do. But if you logged into your TikTok or Instagram, maybe you would have had the polar kind of extremes about him being eulogized and also him being demonized. I don't really know.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously the most recent version of that is Charlie Kirk.
Mm.
But a few weeks ago, at the time of recording, we're September 30th here now, a few weeks, maybe a month or so ago now, there was this interview on CNN with one of the other kind of prime characters in your book, Doug Wilson.
Mm.
And I didn't watch a lot of it, so I'm guilty of like taking a snippet out. But I do remember him saying something, and this is not a quote, this is, I believe, the heart of what he was saying, was that like almost like the proof is in the pudding. I don't really know much about him, to be honest with you, but the proof is in the pudding for him because maybe his parents raised him in this kind of culture. And I think he said something like, if his own children ever became apostate, and I don't know if apostate meant not Christian or just like not necessarily
his kind of Christian.
subscribing to this kind of, that he would then be disqualified from ministry. Does this? Okay, so I did get the gist of this, right? Okay, so what? Just
that is such a good. That's a
I
good
love
reaction.
That should just be the meme for Doug Wilson or Sons. Yeah, he's
That's all I
quite
have.
clear about that. And a number of, there are certain corners of Christian parenting resources where you will find who will just outrightly say, yeah, if this doesn't work out for you, it's your fault, parent. And some of that is because these ideas have been presented as biblical. So if the promise doesn't hold, there's such a respect for the authority of Scripture, then the problem can't be the teaching. It must be user error. Most likely the parent did it wrong. Sometimes researchers will say, well, there's probably a problem with your kid in particular, your prodigal. Wilson is quite unabashed where he says, yeah, he claims 4 generations, I think, without apostasy as proof of generational legacy, which is something he teaches and promises. And in fact says if parents have adult children who fall away, they should be shamed. There's direct quotes of him saying that they should feel that because it was their failure. And yes, his father was a pastor who said if any of his children apostatize, he would step down. And Wilson has said the same, and all his adult children are still cheerfully complying because that is what they were trained up in. And you can read the resources, and it's very clear. It's very punitive. It's very corporal punishment heavy emphasis.
And I should say they have financial incentive to remain compliant. They are all in his business. So I mean, to say like it's because they were well trained to be obedient, I'm like, well, at this point, they're all writing and speaking and podcasting in his network of things. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah. And a whole household incomes are dependent on that, right? Like how it's very costly, I think, to break free from some of that. So from a number of ways. So yeah, there are a lot of parents, I think, who feel that. And so when the promises don't hold, it comes with a lot of shame. And I think this is speaking from a couple decades in pastoral ministry. Seen a number of families. Adult children, I think, sometimes find connection in online spaces to process some of what they maybe are experiencing as if they navigate estrangement or inauthentic connection. My anecdotal observation is for older parents, there's less of that. There's a lot more isolation and shame and a sense of failure, particularly if it seemed like these promises worked for some period of time. And it wasn't until their children were maybe 30 or 40. And then they can feel very isolated and confused. So it's heartbreaking. We hear from a number of people. It's a very difficult thing to navigate. And many of them are doing it alone or in the wreckage of other relationships. A number of people who bought into insular high control communities like Wilson's talked about, how it destroyed their marriages, their relationships with their adult children, like a number of relational fallouts that leave people picking up the pieces. So it's nice for the people at the top to be able to say, look, it works and it worked for me. And here's this cheerful, joyful image. But I think the fruit of the people in the pews is maybe saying otherwise.
It's so, I mean, I can think of so many people who they were raised in the church, and then when they became teenagers, young adults, they drifted, and then, but then when they themselves became parents or when they got a little bit older, they're like, and then they kind of drifted back. And this happens with things that are outside of Christianity too, in some respects. Like, so I grew up. I mean, my last name is French. My dad is from Quebec. I was raised French. And then I was just like, I like English better. And so I really kind of drifted towards English. And then when I came back from the United States, spending a few years down there, I realized, you know what? Je suis français, I'm French, daggum. And so then I leaned into that kind of like, the quote unquote, the way that I was raised or whatever. So like, I hear that proverb, whether it's an absolute truth or not, or whether it's just describing the way that things often work, which is that the way that we raise people often ends up being the way that they turn out. That's kind of really what we get, right? And so, whether or not it's a circuitous route or kind of a straight path. And so maybe it's a good way of bookending the conversation is that and different people are obviously going to feel very differently about this, but one of the things that I think my wrestling through your text has led me towards was just that very question, train up a child in the way that they should go. And when they're old, they will not depart from it. The way is not a way of authoritarianism, even though I believe in authority. The way is not a way of compliance, even though it would be lovely if my children complied a little bit more than they did. But the way is actually the way, the truth, and the life, Jesus Christ. And that's actually what I want with every interaction that I have with them and all the choices that I'm both tasked with and blessed with the opportunity to kind of enforce upon them, for lack of a better word, bring upon them, relate with them. All those things should be, as much as possible, pointing them towards the person and the work of Jesus Christ. That's what hopefully more and more of our young parents will get a chance to do. And hopefully this resource will be part therapy for people who have been through it and who are kind of unlearning some things, or at least maybe seeing some things that were a little bit unseeable for them for the time being. And then also maybe, through conversations like this and also through some of the footnotes near the back of your book, maybe point them towards some other resources and ways of reading the scripture that will help them to be, if the scripture is important to them, help them to be faithful to the scriptures and faithful to the person and work of Jesus Christ without necessarily feeling like there was only one way to understand or apply some of those principles. Any parting words from you guys before we say goodbye to our friends?
No, thanks so much for having us on. It's always, Marissa and I could talk about this stuff for so long, but it's really fun to hear what kind of jumps out or lands differently with different readers, especially for people who work in full-time ministry. I'm glad to know that there are people in ministry reading it, and I don't know. What would you add, Marissa?
Yeah, we did have pastors and therapists in mind when we wrote this too, to say, particularly if they didn't come from this background, to understand the people they seek to serve who did. And I agree. So much of this teaching, we didn't touch on it a lot, but was wrapped up with ideas about God. So in freeing people up to say, look, there's so much freedom for the Christian parent, we also hope that it will free people up to think, what is the implication if the framework isn't that God is a displeased father kind of waiting to pounce with judgment or waiting for me to mess up? There is an invitation there to relationship with him, to meet him on with fresh eyes, that we hope will be healing for people who still retain faith, who are people of faith. So anyway, yes, thank you for the great conversation and for all these good questions, thought-provoking questions.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much, guys. I appreciate your work.